Hello everyone, my name is Cecile Badenhorst and welcome to this presentation on writing a literature review chapter in a master's or a PhD dissertation. So the presentation is about all the things that go into writing a literature review chapter. It's one of the most difficult chapters in a thesis to write. It's very complex and there are multiple things that you as the author are trying to do and that the reader expects to see. So one of the reasons why it's so difficult is because you have to write with the authority and sophistication of an experienced scholar. It's a cognitively difficult chapter to write. So you need to pull together theoretical perspectives, conceptual debates, and previous research perspectives. And one of the most difficult things is that you have to write through others' voices. So you're using the texts in order to construct an argument of your own. And somehow through doing that, you still have to make it your own. So you really are writing through the other texts, using the other texts, and then pulling together an argument of your own. That's what makes it so complex. The purpose of a literature review in a dissertation is to establish the scholarly significance of the research problem by showing previous research in this area. So for a PhD, the scope of this will be much larger, whereas for a master's, you would need to provide less evidence of the scholarly significance. You wouldn't need to provide an overview of the entire research field. Your research overview will be much more specific. The other thing you're doing, particularly with a PhD, is that you're providing a conceptual framework or some kind of perspective for this thesis. Now, not all disciplines require conceptual frameworks, but at some point you will be discussing what approach you're using or what framework you're using, and it's usually in the literature review that this happens. So what are you required to do in a literature review? You're required to be able to see the broader debates in the field. So to be able to see what the big discussion issues are. You're required to be able to see what the connections are between papers and between authors, and which author has generated a range of discussions and how authors connect or disagree with each other. You're also required to show how research is connected, either theoretically or from a particular perspective, or perhaps a particular way of looking at that research or using data in a particular way. So you're required to show the connections in the field. What you're required to do is to understand the gaps in the research, and particularly the gap that your research is going to fill. And generally you need to, what they're looking for is that you have an awareness of the field. So one of the important things to think about in writing a literature review is that it's a process, and it's an iterative process. And by that I mean it's something that you come back to over and over again. So you begin by reading, but you might come back to that article at a later stage and reread it. So you go through this process of initial thoughts from reading, writing, going back to articles, getting different thoughts, maybe finding new discoveries, writing some more. So it's this process that involves, revisiting papers and readings. And the other thing to remember, because the literature review chapter is often one of the most overwhelming chapters, the other thing to remember is that you begin the process as a novice, where you may not know the literature that well. You may not know the field that well because you might not have done that much reading in it. But as you begin to read, you begin to understand the field and to begin to see what the debates are. So the more you move through the process, the more confidence you'll develop about the literature. And then, of course, towards the end of your PhD or your master's, you'll be much more confident about the field that you're reading in. So just keep that in mind when you begin to despair, and think about the fact that it is a process, and you will develop the expertise as you go along. There are three components to writing literature reviews. For me, these three components are important. First of all, you can't write a literature review without reading. The second component is understanding how to write the literature review, what goes into it. And then the third component is citations, which we often see only in terms of conventions, but actually citations play a very important role in helping you construct not only your argument, but your identity as a scholar. Now, I've developed notes on each of these three because I'm not going to be able to go through them in detail in this presentation, but you can find those notes at my blog, and the address is on this slide. So just quickly to do an overview of reading. The only way you find out what's happening in the literature is through reading. The more you read, the more familiar you're going to become with the literature. At the beginning, as I've said, it will seem overwhelming, but as you read, you'll begin to see the same authors appearing, the same points being made, an argument against a particular point, and you'll be able to work out what's happening in the field. The other point I wanted to make on reading was really about reading source documents. If you can, go back to the original document, especially for a PhD. Not so much with a master's. But with a PhD, if you see a source document being quoted quite a lot in the literature, then go back to the original document. I mean, not only is it good in terms of seeing what was written originally, but you'll find that your confidence will increase if you have read the source documents and you're not just relying on other people's interpretations. Now, in the notes on reading, I have quite a bit of information on how to read critically, how to develop notes, how to relate your notes to the research that you're conducting, and the kinds of questions you can think of as you're reading an article. So hopefully those will help you in terms of reading. The next component of the literature review that I think is important for you to understand is the genre. So how is this chapter written? And what goes into it. And the most important thing, I think, is to realize that the literature review chapter is made up of a number of arguments. And these are all subclaims in your overall thesis argument or dissertation argument. But in this chapter, what you're trying to claim is the need for this research, the knowledge gap in the literature, so the scholarly need for this research, your assessment of the research that has been already conducted in the field, and your conceptual framework or perspective, whatever it is that you're using to frame your research. And you might also make an argument about other things. So, for example, in engineering, you might be making an argument about the materials you're using, or in science, you might be making an argument about the models that you're drawing on. So these are the arguments that go into this chapter. So how the chapter works is very similar to other chapters in that you would have the introduction, a main body, and then a conclusion. And in the introduction, you set up the purpose. Why is this chapter important in your thesis? How have you gone about, finding the sources for this chapter? And then you might give the reader some signposting. This is what I'll be discussing first, and then moving into other sections. The main body of a literature review is really open to all sorts of ways of organizing it. And it can depend on your discipline, but it can also just depend on the research and the field. So you may find that using a chronological approach is a very useful one. So for example, if you're tracking a concept or a theory and you want to see how it's changed over time, then showing how authors have used that approach over time would be a chronological approach. So you could say in the 1960s, this is what made up this particular concept, but then it's been critiqued and it's changed over time. So that's a chronological approach. That means looking at the literature as it was written over time. But you may also find a thematic approach useful. That's where you break up the literature into key themes and discuss those themes. You might find a contextual way of organizing the literature is more relevant. So what is the literature in Canada? What is the literature in the UK, in South Africa? The type of publication, I mean, most literature reviews are not organized around this, but you might find that you have a subsection in there where you talk about key books, for example, or key authors, or you might talk about significant journals in the field. So that's just an idea for you in terms of organizing this. You could talk about particular authors and their perspectives. You could group and organize the body in terms of particular authors, key thinkers. You could look at the evolution of a concept and how it's changed in the literature. You could look at key debates, so you could set up your chapter according to the debates and then the counter debates. But really what you're doing in the body of this chapter is you're evaluating the literature and you're identifying gaps. And then in the conclusion, you relate back to the purpose that you stated in the introduction, you summarize the key points, and you relate it to your current research. One of the key problems students often come across in writing this chapter is what to put in and what to leave out. And especially these days, there's so much literature out there that is accessible. It's very difficult to, decide what needs to, what should stay in and what can be left out. So here are some ideas of what you can do. So you can think about the topicality. You could define your subject according to a particular topic. You could refine that topic in order to limit the literature. So if it's a field where there's a lot of literature, so for example social justice, then you might want to refine it to social justice in education, or social justice in adult education, or social justice in adult education in Newfoundland. So you can see that each time you're refining it, it will help you to establish what you should read and what you can leave out. The comprehensiveness, you can also decide how comprehensive you want to make this review. Will you read literature from all over the world, or will you confine it to a particular context? So just make a decision on how comprehensive you want the review to be. The breadth, is it going to be within this discipline, within a sub-discipline, or will you be reading cross-disciplinary? Relevance, this is something else you might want to decide, is what constitutes relevance for you in this literature review, and how does it relate to your purpose. So you can actually set up, when you're deciding to start your search, you can set up these criteria, and you can say, well, I'm only going to look at papers that deal with university students, or perhaps mature university students, or perhaps graduate students. So then you're working out what's relevant. Currency, how far back do you want to go? Do you want to say over the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Or will you only look at the literature within the past 5 years, particularly if it's an area where there is a lot of literature? Exclusions, do you have any exclusions that can limit and define your search? Authority, you can look at particular authorities in the field. You can organize your literature review around these authorities. And then availability, and this is something that's fairly outdated now. It's availability, so limiting your search to what is available. One of the things that I find is so difficult for students to get their head around is what the whole chapter means and what it looks like. So I'm using this analogy from Massey, 1996, just to try and help you see what the literature review does. And this to me is a very useful analogy. She says, she has a number of different analogies in the article, but this is one that I found useful. She says it's like trying to follow animal tracks in unfamiliar territory. So if you're in a terrain and you have a whole bunch of animal tracks ahead of you, how do you find out which ones to follow? That's what a literature review is like. You begin reading, and you may follow a particular track and find that it's a false track. Or you may read older material and find that that material is not helpful anymore. But in a way, you need to do that in order to find your track. So, whether you go down false tracks or not, you're still learning the terrain. So the literature review then is trying to find which track you need to follow in this terrain amongst multiple other tracks. So one of the suggestions I have, or some of the suggestions I have, is to get help if you're struggling with your literature review chapter. You don't have to struggle on your own. One of the things you can do is look for published literature review papers. So papers in your field that are literature reviews. And they may not be literature reviews exactly on your particular topic, but they may be, on the broader field or on aspects of the field. And those are very useful papers to help you see what is happening in the field, because somebody else then has made sense of it for you. So find published literature review papers in your area. The other thing you can do is to get someone to explain the literature to you, either a classmate, another student, or even a professor or a lecturer. You can set up an appointment and just say to them, look, I really don't understand how this person fits in or where this links to that. Can you explain to me? And, people who've been in the field for a while will generally be able to tell you very quickly how things work, and they might be able to draw a diagram for you to show you how all the components fit together. Another tip this is what I do, particularly if I'm reading in a new area, is to order all the papers and books chronologically, and then read from the earliest one to the most current one. If you do that, you can see how things unfold over time in the papers. So you'll be able to see where one person makes an argument and then somebody argues against that, and where that person then refines that argument in a later paper. So if you're really struggling with your field, or order your papers chronologically and read them in that order. It'll give you a good sense of how things have happened. The other tip I would give you is to take a literature review paper, a published literature review paper, and deconstruct it. So have a look how the introduction was written, how did they organize the body, how have they pulled together their conclusions. And then you can use that as a model if it's something that you feel can help you. The other thing that is really helpful is to draw a diagram, to draw almost like an organogram of how the authors and papers all fit together. So if there's a key thinker, which authors have drawn on that key thinker? How has their thinking added to or changed what the key author had to say? And get a big piece of paper and just scribble your drawing down. It doesn't have to be neat. It's really just about thinking, mapping the literature or the field. And then the last tip that I have for you is to do big picture reading as well as detailed reading. And by that I mean, when you're doing the big picture reading, you're doing a search according to your criteria, and maybe what you're doing is collecting the abstracts and then reading across all the abstracts and making the initial decisions and saying, yes, this is relevant, no, this isn't relevant. In reading across the abstracts like that, you get the broad sense of the field. And then you can identify which articles you'll need to read in detail. And then those articles you can read specifically in depth, do an in-depth reading of it. Okay, to quickly move on to citations. Citations play a very important role in any chapter, but particularly the literature review chapter, because one of the things your readers are trying to see is how much you have read. So citations really play an important role in this chapter. But here are a number of different ways for using citations. So, I mean, one of the most common ways is to acknowledge the idea or thinking from somebody else. So that's the intellectual property rights. But the other thing you're doing with citations is you're acknowledging the history of thinking in this area. So you're not saying my research begins at this point with a tabula rasa behind me. What you're saying is, I know that lots of other people have thought about this, and this is how they have thought about it. But what my research is doing is thinking about it slightly differently. Citations also help your reader to find your sources, and this is something that I think writers often don't think about. But dissertation readers, examiners, will look up your citations because they are interested in them. So, paying attention to your citations is important for that. One of the key reasons for citing is to provide evidence. Evidence comes in the form of secondary published sources in academic context. So when you're citing, you are providing evidence for whatever arguments you're making or claims you're making. The other thing that happens with citations is that anyone you cite is making a statement about who you think is important or significant. So if I'm citing this person versus that person, I'm making a choice which my reader can then see about who I think is significant. Citations also show your discourse community. So it shows your knowledge of that discourse community, and it also shows your affiliations. So, for example, if I cite Freire in education, then my reader knows immediately that I'm coming from a particular perspective because I've cited that author. And then the last reason why you would use citations is that you draw on authorities to help you substantiate your claims. So if I cite a big name in the field after making a particular claim, then what I'm saying is that this authority has also said that, and I'm agreeing with that. So citations matter. They matter because your reader is interpreting who you are citing as well as what you are citing. So how and who you cite contributes to your overall argument. And just to give you a very brief example, so if you're using a single author who's a key authority, as I've said, then you're making a statement about that authority, what perspective that authority has, and how you are aligning yourself with that authority. The other way citations matter, I mean, this is just to give you an example, is that if you group multiple authors together after a particular point, so you make a point and then you cite multiple authors, then what you're doing there is not only collecting bits of the literature together, so you're showing patterns, but you're also saying this is a significant point because so many people have agreed with the way I think. So that's just an example of how citing single authors or citing multiple authors says a lot more than just acknowledging where the ideas come from. So citations show how much you have read, who you've read, okay, how you've evaluated source texts and decided which ones were important, how well you understand the content and the issues in the source texts, where you stand in relation to those source texts, and how well you can read the discourse and respond to the discourse community. And what that means is, do you understand the field? Can you understand the debates in the field? Can you see what counts as and what is valuable in that discourse community? So it's very important to evaluate your sources because that's part of what you're trying to do in this literature review. So, I mean, the kind of basic evaluation of sources is, who is it written by? Is it someone who's an authority in the field, or is it someone who's fairly obscure? Is this current literature? Has it been published recently, or is it a fairly old text? Has it been published in a reputable journal or by a reputable book publisher? Is it peer-reviewed? And is it relevant to the topic that I'm dealing with? Now, obviously, if you have a text that doesn't fit any of this criteria, you can still make the argument for using texts outside of these evaluations, but you would need to then make the argument and provide evidence. So perhaps you've got a text that's very old. You could make the argument that this is a classic text and that most of the subsequent debates are based on this early text, and you think it's worthwhile to go back to the original text. So literature reviews are cognitively complex, as I've said before, because you begin by writing summaries of relevant sources, but right throughout the process, you're going through this thing of selecting what's important and leaving out. So right from the beginning, even though you're writing summaries, you're making decisions about the material. And you're doing things like comparing, contrasting, working out the validity of sources. You're analyzing the sources, so you're looking for patterns. You're synthesizing, so you're looking for connections. And you're evaluating, where you're making judgments based on meanings. So it's a very complex chapter. And one of the ways to work through the complexity is to use Bloom's taxonomy. And if you haven't come across this before, it's a really useful little technique, and it's not meant to be used rigidly. And I'm using an older version of Bloom's, but it's still helpful, even if you want to use the newer version. So I'm really using this as a heuristic to allow you to understand what the writing looks like in a literature review, and how you can adapt your writing to achieve what you need to achieve. So Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchy of thinking skills, and the hierarchy is dependent on the thinking skill that comes before that. So, for example, you can't understand or comprehend something if you don't have knowledge, and you can't apply it if you don't have knowledge and comprehension. So you can't analyze unless you have knowledge, comprehension, and are able to apply the knowledge. So it works like that across the taxonomy. So how does this apply to literature reviews? Well, when you're writing and you summarize, that's when it's at the knowledge stage. If you can summarize and then apply that to your research, then you're moving from knowledge through comprehension to application. If you can identify patterns and themes across the source articles, across your summaries that you've written, then what you're doing is you're moving into analysis, because now what you're doing is you're pulling the literature apart and you're grouping them into themes, contexts, however you've decided to organize that literature. And at the same time, you're assessing the validity and the relevance of these source articles. Then once you've got your themes, you've ordered your themes, your summaries into themes, then what you need to do is to take those themes and put them back together again, but with more insight. So this is where you're constructing your argument, where you're saying, okay, this is what's in the literature, but now what's important about this? What can I say about this? Why do I need to put these themes in? So you're making an argument around the themes in the literature. And then you're relating those patterns that you found in the literature to your own research. So then you're moving into higher order thinking skills like synthesis. And then the last step in the thinking skills hierarchy is evaluation. And that's where you're looking back over the whole process and you're saying, okay, how can I show that my argument is sound? How can I provide evidence for what I've said, what I've said in this argument that I've made? And you might do that through including counter arguments or showing the nuances in the literature. So not everything is cut and dried, and it's not an argument where one person is posing something against another person. You might find that they say yes, but, so there are nuances in the literature. So when you move into that higher order thinking skills, you're really evaluating the whole process. So I hope you can see that using Bloom's taxonomy, it gives you some insights on how to move from knowledge, the knowledge level, which is a lower order thinking skill, where you would write summaries or of source articles to the higher order thinking skills. So the very last slide here is really about some quick strategies that you can use. One of the most common things that students will say is that it's just so overwhelming. The literature review chapter is just too overwhelming. So if at any point you feel like it's overwhelming, you need to break it down into the smallest bit you can find. So perhaps you begin with 2 articles. You read the 2 articles, you summarize them, and you compare them. Then you add another article, summarize, compare. And if you know how to use free writing, then write notes, but also do a free write, so that you have your notes which you would cite in the chapter, and then your free writes which are really about your thinking around these articles. And just remember that it is a process. The more that you read, just naturally you will begin to align yourself with some authors and not with others. So just through reading, you will find yourself sorting the literature and saying, these are the authors that I find resonate with me, and these don't. So that's one way of beginning to organizing this. The other strategy I would suggest is to set a time limit for reading, because reading can be a procrastination activity as well, where we spend enormous amounts of time reading and very little time writing. So I would suggest that you spend time thinking about your searching strategies. So you set up the criteria for the searching. Then you move into actually searching for literature, searching, downloading papers or collecting books and articles from the library. And you set a time limit to that. And then you move into writing. So, you don't have to be rigid about this, but if you set a time limit, then you're saying to yourself, I'm going to start writing at this point. I can still read at a later point, but at this point, I'm going to start writing. Then once you've written, you can always go back to your search, add new literature, but you will at least have something written down that you can work with. This last slide has all the references that I've used in this slideshow. There are a lot of sources out there now to help you write the literature review. Even just a Google search on the internet will come up with all sorts of ways to help you write the literature review. There are plenty of YouTube videos, and in the notes that I've developed, I've added some YouTube videos that I think are very worthwhile. So there's a lot of help out there. You don't have to struggle on your own. I hope you found this useful. Please go and visit my blog for the extra information. And you can let me know there if there's anything else you need to know or if you have any other comments. Thanks. Bye.